Hail hail and welcome to part 7 of the Celtic History podcast series, which charts the history of Celtic Football Club from 1887 to the current day. In part 6 of the series, titled Making a Stand, Chris was joined by Paul Brennan from Celtic Quick News, and they covered the period from 1950 to 1960. In a trying decade, the club clinches its first trophy in a number of years. This is soon followed by trouble at a New Year derby match that had major consequences as the club's identity came under attack from the SFA. The fight is taken up by Robert Kelly and ends with the club re-establishing pride in its Irish heritage. On the pitch, things were equally demanding as the board controlled all aspects of team selection. However, there are still limited successes in this period as the team fielded famous names such as Willie Fernie, Bertie Peacock and Neilly Mochan. The boys detail a Jock Stein signing as he returns to Scotland from the Welsh leagues, and they examine Tully mania throughout the decade. We hear from ex-players who began their careers in this period and discover details concerning the death of young Jackie Millsap. There are details of a playing kit worn throughout the 1950s, songs sung by the fans at the time, all mixed with more fan stories and confessions.
1951, and this was the first trophy that Celtic had lifted since 1938.
The Coronation Cup would now reside permanently at Parkhead.
You're then starting to see more supporters coming over from Ireland.
Jimmy Gribbon was the man that says, look, what about Jock Stein, the old Albion Rovers player? From that moment on, just completely and utterly immersed himself in our football club.
There was bad trouble on the terracing at the New Year's Day game between Celtic and Rangers when the SFA instructed Celtic to take the Irish flag down.
Celtic flying the Irish tricolour was a provocative act.
This was no ordinary flag either, having been presented to the club by none other than Eamon de Valera, the first Irish Taoiseach of the Irish Free State.
Stein's commanding presence and organisational skills quickly made him a vital influence on the pitch.
You can't believe the unprofessionalism that was going about at Celtic. This led to anarchy on the football field.
And the score was, of course,
7-1.
Hampden in the sun.
That was the score when it came time up that Tim Alloys had won the cup.
It was a dark time and we could have just disappeared.
I'm a Celtic man because I think we are the finest club the world has ever seen.
Celtic lost more games in the 1950s than in any decade. The board hired and fired scouts, hired and fired coaches, hired and fired football players. Charlie Tully was this huge, enormous icon at a time when that was pretty much all we had.
The only change to the home kit was made in 1956 when we started to wear smaller shorts.
During the game, Millsap began to feel pains in his stomach, and afterwards he was rushed to hospital.
After the game I've left and the locals are actually clapping the Celtic fans coming into the ground.
My favourite other players possibly, probably Packy Bona.
If you woke up in the morning and somebody says, what's Celtic, what would you say?
A way of life.
A stand that Celtic made at the time to say that they were here and they're here for the long haul and they weren't going to back down in the face of any adversities.
Now we join Chris McGuigan for part 7 of the series, where he will cover the period of 1960 to 1970 with his guest, FIFA.com journalist and author, Mr. Stephen Sullivan.
Bill Shankly said to Stein one afternoon in Lisbon town, "Hey Jock, now you're immortal with the European crown. Oh, Glasgow was a sea of green that night, as I recall. We sang Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic over all."
Chapter 7. Celtic Football Club, 1960 to 1970. For Celtic fans, the early 1960s were anything but swinging. While the 1950s witnessed occasional yet glorious moments of success, the opening seasons of a new decade brought only frustration. The Hoops hadn't won a major trophy since the famous League Cup triumph of 1957, and as established stars retired or were sold, the Parkhead club attempted to replace experienced internationals with youthful, homegrown hopefuls. Disillusionment was rife, both on the terraces and in the dressing room. Jimmy McGrory was manager in name only. Power on and off the pitch rested almost exclusively with chairman Robert Kelly. There was no doubt this youthful Celtic side contained considerable potential. In youngsters like Paddy Crowin, Billy McNeil and Stevie Chalmers, there was ample talent in the Parkhead ranks. But the aspirations of the Hoops faithful had been curtailed for years by a lack of leadership and Kelly's disastrous meddling with team selection. It was indicative of how expectations had fallen, but in April 1961, there was little surprise when a well-organised Dunfermline lifted the Scottish Cup after a 2-0 replay victory over a rudderless Celtic. A cup final loss is never easy to swallow, but on this occasion, the taste of defeat was bittersweet. The architect of the Pars Hamlin success had been a man who the Celtic faithful viewed as their own, Jock Stein. The Dunfermline manager had been an inspirational leader in his days as a double-winning Celtic captain. Retirement due to a knee injury failed to dampen his passion for the game, or indeed for Celtic, where he had taken on duties as a coach working with the reserves. Stein would quickly prove to be an extremely capable and popular coach. His ideas and enthusiasm enthralled young players with an insatiable appetite to improve the game. At East End Park, Stein enjoyed a productive apprenticeship in his new trade. He quickly transformed the Fifes from relegation candidates into trophy winners. Part of a new breed of tracksuit managers, Stein was a football progressive. While Celtic stumbled from one trophyless season to another, Jock Stein was a man going places. In the spring of 1964, Jock had been tempted to swap Fife for Easter Road, and again his efforts began to reap immediate rewards. His Hibernian side picked up the Summer Cup and rapidly established themselves as serious title contenders. Stein's reputation grew with almost every passing game, and on the terraces of Celtic Park, the supporters cast an envious and admiring glance eastwards. But Stein's efforts were also being noted in the Parkhead boardroom. Celtic were drifting hopelessly. League form was mediocre, and trips to Hampden now tended to end in heartbreak. In 1963, Celtic lost the replayed Scottish Cup final 2-0 to Rangers. The first game had ended goalless, but for the return, Chairman Kelly had tinkered once more with team selection, dropping from the starting line-up an exciting young winger by the name of Jimmy Johnston. A surprisingly fine run in the following season's European Cup Winners' Cup could not disguise the serious plight the club faced. Season 1964-65 would represent a watershed moment in the club's history. The youthful Hoops enjoyed a promising start to their campaign, but a 2-1 League Cup final defeat to Rangers in October was the latest body blow to a team desperate to reward the Parkhead fans with a trophy. Celtic suffered a slump in form, and as New Year approached, even Bob Kelly recognised that the time had come for change. Jock Stein had remained in close touch with his friends at Celtic, including Kelly. Knowing the Parkhead chairman was now under intense pressure from an increasingly frustrated support, Jock made his move to return to the Hoops. Stein informed Kelly he was thinking of moving to Wolverhampton Wanderers, and superficially asked for his advice. But amid all the talk of a switch to Wolves, Stein was posing Kelly a much simpler question: do you want me as manager of Celtic? So it was, in January 1965, Kelly announced that Jock Stein would be returning to Celtic as manager. Stein's assistant would be a man already part of a Parkhead setup, Sean Fallon. The former teammates would soon forge a formidable partnership. The appointment of Stein was an obvious and logical solution to Celtic's troubles, but Kelly would have to relinquish all control of playing matters. Further to that, Stein would be Celtic's first non-Catholic manager, and the chairman worried if such a move would be seen as a betrayal of the club's traditions. He should have known better. Stein's appointment was met with all the joy of a family welcoming home their favourite son. Stein would not take up his post until March, but the appointment instantly injected a renewed sense of hope throughout the entire club. For many players and fans, Jock wasn't regarded as the best man for the job. He was the only man for the job. In his last act as a manager of Hibernian, Stein guided the Edinburgh side to a Scottish Cup victory over Rangers. That same weekend, Celtic would progress to the semi-finals with a deserved win over a good Kilmarnock side. With the arrival of Stein now imminent, the Parkhead faithful began to dream of their first Scottish Cup in 11 years. Celtic would progress to that Hampden final, where on April the 25th a crowd of 108,000 was gathered in the sunshine for a clash with an impressive Dunfermline. An exhilarating encounter swung from one end to the other, and as the game entered the closing stages, the match was tied at 2 each. With just 9 minutes remaining, Celtic forced a corner. Charlie Gallagher hit a firm and high ball into the area, and there it was met by a charging Billy McNeill. The Celtic skipper leapt high and powered the ball into the Dunfermline net. The Scottish Cup was returning to paradise. Just weeks after taking his place in the Celtic dugout, Jock Stein had made the Hoops winners again. And once they started winning, Stein's Celts found it very difficult to stop. Season 1965-66 saw the Celts claim their first championship since 1954. The highlight of the title triumph, a 5-1 thrashing of Rangers at Parkhead. Inroads were being made in Europe too. An impressive European Cup Winners' Cup campaign was ended at the semi-final stage by a fortunate Liverpool. The League Cup was claimed, but a treble was denied when Rangers rode their luck to snatch victory in a replayed Scottish Cup final. But despite that Hampden triumph for the Ibrox side, there was no denying the tide had turned in favour of the Parkhead club. The rest of Scottish football was about to be swept away by a green and white tidal wave.
He said Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic over all.
Welcome to Chapter 7 of the Celtic History Podcast, and once again I'm delighted to have a little chat with Stephen Sullivan from FIFA.com, previously the Celtic View, and the biographer of the new Sean Fallon book, which will be hitting the shelves pretty soon. Good afternoon, Stephen, how are you?
Good afternoon, Chris. Thanks for having me on again. Great pleasure to be here.
Did I get your full...
Listened to them so far, it's been great.
Did I get your full titles and all in there? You know, I mean,
yeah, it sounds very grand.
Well, Stephen, I mean, this is the 60s. You've got the plum draw, so you have you're the envy of everybody. So you are that's been involved in the podcast so far. So you have a big job in front of you.
I can imagine. Yeah, is there a few things that happened in the 60s?
And the Beatles and stuff.
I looked through, do my research. I couldn't really think off the top of my head, but it turns out there were a few. No, I can imagine I've got the job everyone else wanted. But no, thanks very much, because I'm sure they were worthy of candidates, but much appreciated.
Well, Stephen, I asked you on because you probably wouldn't have had to do as much homework as everybody else because you were doing all the research for the Sean Fallon book that's coming out.
Very true. No, that is very true. And I mean, I think we were talking a bit off air, and I mean, some of the things that you think you don't know so much about, and even all these podcasts, you find little gems all over the place, and it's just absolutely fascinating going back into the club's history and speaking to people and just finding things out that you don't know. It's just such a joy to do that.
And the 60s is a really good example of that, because everybody thinks of the 60s, wow, the 60s, fantastic. Yeah. But when you look at 1960 and 1965, it wasn't very good.
No, that's it. I mean, you could really just draw a line down the middle of the 60s, really, couldn't you? And just split it, because the start of the 60s was as bad as any period. I mean, I know that we've been going over some pretty gloomy times in the previous podcast, but the start of the 60s was really as bad as it got, and the fans who'd previously stayed very, very tolerant and loyal were really starting to get frustrated, and it was becoming quite a nasty atmosphere at Celtic Park. A lot of the young players who were around then found it a really tough place to play. Like Bobby Murdoch was getting slaughtered every week, pretty much. John Hughes especially. I mean, he was playing 40-odd games when he was 17, 18 this season. And, they were just getting, absolutely slaughtered every week. Comparisons, unfavourable comparisons drawn to great players in the past. And, you look at the league finishes, you're talking about, they finished 9th in 1960, 9th in the league. But, they won 12 of their 34 matches, and that just shows you how far they sunk. But it was obviously it came about as a part of this policy that Bob Kelly decided to embark on, the Kelly kids, and it was pretty disastrous, to say the least.
And that was the policy of the club at the time. It was all based on youth.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I thought the podcast about the 50s was absolutely fascinating, and I heard Paul Brennan talking about the financial necessity almost of going down this route because the crowds weren't as good. But actually, I think as well from what Sean said and what I've learned about Bob Kelly, he was such a romantic. He was not a practical man. I think he saw what a fantastic story the Busby Babes was, and that at that point that story was just the talk of football throughout Europe and the world. Obviously, quite soon after the Munich air disaster, because it had been a tragedy, but it was also this really romantic story about how this club had been revived after the war by these young kids, and Celtic really hadn't recovered after the war, and so Bob Kelly would have seen this and thought, well, why can't we do the same? And the irony, of course, is that Bob Kelly had the chance to get Matt Busby at the start of the 60s. Well, according to his fellow directors, they were really confident he wanted to come back up to Scotland, and they could have made him manager. And this was just a couple of years after they'd gone so close to being relegated, Celtic, and Bob Kelly decided against it. I mean, he pretty much lost faith in Jimmy McGrory, but he decided against pursuing Matt Busby, and there was big fallout within his family over this. So he'd not back Matt Busby, but he'd watched what he'd done at Manchester United subsequently, and he'd been just thought the whole idea was just it played into his romantic ethos, and so he thought, well, why can't the same be done at Celtic? Mm-hmm. And the funny thing was that at first it was very well received. You had people in the press writing that this team is going to surpass what the Busby Babes did, and then sure enough it all fell apart because he sold. Obviously you had Sean retired, you had Billy McPhail retired in 58 as well, and you had these guys going, you had Charlie Tully retiring around that time as well, and then they sold the kind of just the backbone of the team. So Bobby Collins, Bobby Evans, Willie Fernie, and then even Bertie Peacock, who'd been such a great stalwart for so many years, was phased out of the team. So it was really just youngsters, and that was all they left. And there was no experience there was no character there was no personality there, and the team just fell apart. It was known as a very mentally weak team. And
the success was obviously slim pickings, but this team made it to a few finals during the early 60s as well, but they just, as you say, they weren't mentally strong enough to get over the final line. With the Scottish Cup, they were in the Scottish Cup final in 1961, 1963. They lost the League Cup in 1964, and then famously, of course, they lost the semi-final of the European Cup Winners' Cup in 1964 too. So it was all very close, but not close enough.
I mean, they had so much. You look at the talent, and the talent was there. There's no doubt about it. But they got to the finals, and there was, especially where Rangers were concerned, there was this psychological inferiority complex they had with Rangers. And when they got to finals, when they played Old Firm games, the record in Old Firm games was just woeful. And whenever they got to this stage, whenever anything came up, whenever anything presented, any barrier came up against them, they just wilted. And you see that, but also as well, they saw what was happening behind the scenes. They saw that Jimmy McGrory, I think Billy McNeil's phrase was like a doorkeeper by that stage. Yeah. And that Sean Fallon was there. He was doing as much as he could behind the scenes, but he wasn't influential. That was a fact. And then they didn't know where the calls were coming from. It was always, you had Bob Kelly, who was really just pulling the strings, making some pretty bizarre team selections. And these cup finals were the prime example. I mean, again, it would just be sometimes strange decisions, sometimes romantic decisions, but even after they took Rangers to a replay in '63, and he took out Jinky, who'd been outstanding in the first game. Like Jinky and Frank Haffey had been the two outstanding players, and he put in Craig, who'd hardly played all season, and it had a disastrous game. And Celtic fans, I think 30,000 Celtic fans left half an hour before the end of the game, which was just unheard of, because it was always Celtic where the fans were known as the faithful, and they just did not desert their team. And half an hour to go, they just walked out because they just couldn't stomach facing it anymore, and that was Jim Baxter was keeping the ball up and sitting on the ball, and there was talk that it could have been another 7-1 for that. It could have been Rangers 7-1, but that they started showboating, but that was how dominant they were and how demoralised Celtic were. And but as I say, it was a real inferiority complex when it came to Rangers, and particularly with Baxter. I think Baxter had a fantastic record, no firm games at that time. I think he lost 3 out of 20 odd, and likes of Bobby Murdoch, and these guys were just completely in awe of him. And it took someone like Stein to come back and just give them the confidence and the arrogance that eventually came from believing that they were as good as these guys, and then believing they were better than them.
On the line, I have Ian Young. Ian, how you doing this afternoon?
I'm good, Chris. How about yourself?
Oh, not too bad, not too bad. So just to get us kicked off, Ian, tell us a wee bit about how you actually came to play for Celtic.
My father, who usually came in and gave us lots of words of encouragement when we won, was delayed, and I was wondering where he was, what happened, and he came in and he said, "Well done, boys," went round and spoke to everybody, and then he came to me and he said, "Celtic want to sign you."
Uh-huh.
I said, "What?" He said, "Celtic want to sign you." I said, "They want me to play a trial or something?" He said, "No, they want to sign me." So it took a wee bit of sinking in, and eventually he said that they'd approached him after the game, and they were waiting outside, and outside it was Sean Fallon and Bob Kelly.
Uh-huh.
And Sean said that they would like us to come to Celtic and on a part-time contract, and they would really like us to sign for them.
So what was it like going to Celtic at that stage, Ian? Because, obviously the club was in the doldrums. Jimmy McGrory was still in charge, still the figurehead of the manager or coach. What was it actually like to go and get involved in Celtic at that time?
Well, it was probably a dream come true, in as much as it playing for a senior team, playing for one of the 2 top teams in the country. But to go and walk in the door, and first person I saw was Pat Crerand, and then Sean took us into the dressing room and introduced us to players like Billy McNeil and Steve Chalmers and a host of others, Duncan Mackay, just a host of names that you only read about, and you only played for Scotland and things like that. So it was overwhelming, I would say.
And what was the atmosphere about the club like then? I mean, obviously they hadn't won a trophy for a number of years, and that team that sort of, you were involved in, in the 9-in-a-row team and Jock Stein and all the rest, but that hadn't happened yet. I mean, was the team and was the club still ambitious at that stage, or were they, sort of playing second fiddle?
No, I think that the club was still ambitious, and the atmosphere, I mean, I wouldn't have noticed any sort of lack, anything that there was a kind of heavy atmosphere around that because they hadn't won anything. Because footballers are focused on winning the next tournament, winning the next league. There was plenty of ambition among the players to go and win. But whether there was the confidence to actually go and win, because the confidence was kind of getting sapped as time went on, because I think it was 57 time.
That's right.
Last time they'd won a trophy, and this was 61 when I joined, but 62, 63 it was beginning to get to the point where I think there was a lack of confidence about the team. Sean was the coach and it motivated the players okay. Jimmy McGrory was the manager, and would come in and give a few words of encouragement before the game, which was really, I think, all I had experienced, in juvenile football. But when Jock came, it was totally different,
Okay, so you mentioned Jimmy McGrory there. I mean, obviously Jimmy McGrory was a Celtic legend, in his playing days for sure. What was it like to encounter Jimmy McGrory in later life when he was the manager?
Well, Jimmy McGrory was probably one of the gentlest, nicest men I've ever met. He probably didn't have the knowledge and the sort of coaching ability and the motivational ability that Jock Stein had. But I think that most players at that time were not used to playing for a manager like Jock Stein, maybe more a manager like Jimmy McGrory, perhaps a bit more motivational. Tactics were not a sort of thing that the managers, in my experience, sort of talked about. They would talk about who to mark and how they would play and that sort of thing, but actually putting a team out to play to a set system or anything like that, you went out and played to your ability, I think, He wasn't anything like what Jock Stein was like in terms of being able to motivate, being able to... you felt when Jock was in charge that he had an advantage over every other team, whereas when Jimmy was in charge, you didn't feel that, But you felt that because you were playing for Celtic, you had better players than the other teams and that you were going to win anyway, So the players were pretty motivated themselves, but it was just a different mindset, different style of management,
And then, of course, when we entered into the 60s, and by 1965, then, whenever Jock Stein came into the club, you'd been there a couple of years. How did it change, Ian?
Well, I think that there was a good number of players had played under Jock when he coached the second team. Like Billy McNeil and Charlie Gallagher and players like that had played under Jock in the reserves. We knew that he was good. So when I remember we were getting dressed for training, and Billy McNeil came into the dressing room and said, "Big Jock's coming back," and you could almost feel the confidence in the dressing room rising. Everybody was enthusiastic and excited about it. So that in itself made me think, this is somebody special who's coming,
It became very obvious that there was two different personalities there. You had Sean, mild-mannered Sean, and you had Jock, who was probably a wee bit straighter than Sean.
Yeah.
How did the two of them play off each other, Ian?
I think they played off each other pretty well. Sean would come and encourage after Jock had blasted you. But, so I think that worked, and Sean was more in the dressing room, he was more the sort of... Sean had been the first team coach and did most of the work with the players, training and that sort of thing. And he was always well liked, and he was a very likeable guy. And so I think Sean kind of worked the dressing room, if you like, encouraged players when they playing, and sort of kept things going. Whereas Jock, quite rightly, for a manager, stayed that bit apart, and was then probably in a better position to, if players needed a joke, then he would give them a joke and that sort of thing. So he wasn't sort of, he wasn't a pal of the players in the dressing room, He was a manager.
But he commanded huge respect, Ian, didn't he?
He did, aye. We knew he was a manager, and players played for him.
No,
because he knew if they didn't play for him, that wouldn't be tolerated, and that he would be out, so... it was good. It was good, I must admit.
So how did things change? You touched on it earlier on that you always felt you had a competitive advantage when you played under Jock Stein, compared to the other teams because of this idea of tactics and a sort of a whole new ethos towards football.
Well, he knew the other teams, he knew them well because he'd obviously done his homework, and we had a board where he used to do tactics on the board, which we'd never done before, and people knew what their role was and where they were playing, and if you didn't play to that role, then they would tell you, So that was new, but the training was incredibly different as well. and I think maybe that was one of the biggest things, that before he came, we had probably a practice match at the end of every training session behind the goals and at Celtic Park, and the training was hard and it was boring because we were running around the track and such like. But when Jock came, you were running around the park with a ball. Everything was done with the ball, you know. The training was new, it was exciting, things we had never done before. Jock was getting us to do, you know, and it was just a joy to be at training, whereas before, in my opinion, it had been really quite boring, you know, and I was never a good trainer. But the difference between, you could run round the park 20 times a ball at your feet and not be tired, you know, whereas if you're just running round the park, you know, you're bored and you get tired after 10 laps maybe, you know, but so that was the difference.
Even when you look at that European Cup Winners' Cup semi-final when they lost in 1964 to Budapest, Celtic were 3-0 up from the first leg, and then it must have just been total naivety to go out and get humped 4-0 in the second leg. It was definitely naivety, and there's no doubt about that. And I think that again it went to Bob Kelly's head. He was been praised throughout Europe. Celtic were being praised throughout Europe and throughout Scotland. They came back from Zagreb in the previous round, and Rangers gave them a guard of honour onto the park because they'd got so far and they were playing such great football. They were being lauded throughout Europe as this, you know, swashbuckling attacking team, and it went to his head, and he was being interviewed ahead of the second leg going over there, and he said, "Oh, we'll attack again. Of course we'll attack. That's the way Celtic play." And you know, you're 3-0 up, and you think. I remember Sean saying, looking ahead, he said, you know, everyone talked about the Dukla Prague game in '67. He said he really felt that came from MTK Budapest, the memory of it, even though it was Jock Stein who wasn't at the club at that time. It was a memory of having thrown away a semi-final, you know, having thrown away such a commanding lead. Yeah. And he said they went over there, and he said we thought that time all that matters is getting through. You know, that's all that matters in a semi-final. But over there, I think the famous Bob Kelly speech pre-match was he went in and he slapped his leather glove into his hand and said, you know, well, beat them at Celtic Park, we can beat them again here. And just go out and play your usual game. No containing tactics, no looking at hit people on the break, no tactics, just go out and play your usual game. And they were destroyed because MTK were a great side. They were the side that had been inspired by Jimmy Hogan, funny enough, when I was working Hungary. And again, so we heard a lot about him in the last podcast as a fascinating character. And MTK were the team that came up from that, and they had this great Hungarian Karoli Sandor. He missed the first leg, and he was their absolutely key player. And he came back, and he just destroyed. They just couldn't get anywhere near him. So I think it was such a major, major blow to morale, and because there had been protests that season. That season started off after the cup final replay mentioned where Drinkies dropped, and the fans are walking out. There were protests against Kelly. There were, the crowds had gone down to the mid-teens, and you had 2,000 fans after one game against Queen of the South, I think it was, outside the ground, chanting, "We want Kelly." And then the season goes on, and they go on this really surprising European run. To be honest, speaking to the guys, John Clarkson, who were in that team, none of them really saw it coming, because it was really kind of contrasted fairly starkly with what was going on at the club in general and back home. So it was a surprising run, and they were getting a lot of praise for it. But obviously, that praise ended up, becoming, you had guys who were struggling with injuries, and they were told, just get yourself fit for the final, and they were bickering with UEFA over the final venue even before they qualified for it, because it was this assumption that they were already there, and it was always disastrous. And even when you look at the teams that we played right up to the semi-final, there was no mugs, even though with Ball from Switzerland we won quite comfortably 10-1 aggregate. But then you had Dynamo Zagreb, and then you had Slovan Bratislava, and then when you look at the semi-final and you see this Budapest team, you think, well, we've beaten better teams up to the semi-final, then Budapest, and then you're absolutely right. Then you start talking about the Jimmy Hogan influence and stuff like that. And this team really showed its inexperience going out there with the tie one, only to throw it away.
It did, and you always, I think they probably saw it as soon as the second goal went in, as soon as they saw the pattern of the game. It wasn't a team that responded well to adversity at that point. There weren't the personalities in there. They'd got rid of Bertie Auld in the early 60s, and Paddy Crerand had gone as well. And these guys who were arrogant, who were the best, and that's a good thing in football. Sometimes you need a bit of that, and Bertie Auld, when he came back, made just a world of a difference. But they didn't have that in the team, and I think Jim Kennedy was the oldest guy in the team, and he was, mid to late 20s, and he didn't have the personalities, and he said that, Jim Kennedy said that, and you had even Jimmy McGrory, who was just, the nicest possible man, saying this team doesn't have the mental strength that Celtic teams have had in the past. And the criticism was more than fair, because really they were, I remember speaking to Pat Woods, a great Celtic historian, and he said these guys were losers, and that's just what they were. They said that until Stein came in, these guys just had a losing mentality. They weren't strong enough to bounce back, and that was why I think that was part of the reason, which obviously we'll come on to, about the 65 Cup finals, was that they did face adversity in those games and they came back, and that was what helped turn it around, and Stein gave them that belief.
And was it occasions like this that prompted the change in the management? From your research, from doing the Sean Fallon book and concentrating very closely on this era, what was going on at the club? What actually prompted Bob Kelly to say, okay, enough is enough, we need to move Jimmy McGrory upstairs and bring in something different?
I mean, I was fascinated to ask Sean about this whole period, the early 60s, because it is one of these areas that it's not completely explained. I felt, going in to speak to him about that, exactly what the balance of power was, and especially what Sean's role was, and all that. And I said, because in some reports you'll see, and you speak to some players and they said, well, I kind of thought Sean was kind of half running it by then. Then you speak to other people who say, oh, well, we all knew that Sean didn't have any authority, it was just Bob Kelly. And you speak to other people who said, well, I thought Bob Kelly was giving Sean the orders, and there was this undercurrent that Sean was being groomed for the manager's job. And there's no doubt that was the case. There's no doubt that Bob Kelly had seen Sean he was the man he wanted to become manager. And the real shame was, I think there was a fork in the road, probably 1960, because you'd had Jock Stein had been in charge of the reserves. Sean had been working with him and been working with the third team, and they've been doing great things together. I mean, everyone who was part of the setup at that time said that you were better off being in the reserves, working with these guys, because you got proper coaching, you get real education, and it was a team that was already the management team that would work so well after 65 was already working well, kind of almost like a shadow management team there in the second and third team. And it was a case, well, did Bob Kelly, was he willing to go the extra mile and promote Jock Stein at that time and move them up? And he decided against that again. He stayed back Jimmy McGrory. I don't know if that's the right word, because he still absolutely controlled Jimmy McGrory, and he was, and I think everyone says that Jimmy McGrory was never the same man. Again, you're going back to podcast twice past, but it's all linked up. After 48, when they were so nearly relegated, he really, I think John McPhail said it was then he completely gave up the reins. He gave up control to Bob Kelly, because he started doubting himself, and he didn't have the same strength of personality. And so by the 60s, he'd just been weaker than he ever was before. But his health was starting to suffer, and so was Bob Kelly's, because the team, the team's success, it might have seemed that they were, especially Kelly, was kind of, he wasn't affected by it, but it was certainly getting to them, and he was getting abused every week from the little bit of terracing below the stand. And I think as well there were financial aspects to it, because the crowds were just dipping and dipping. You were getting crowds of 11,000, which was just unheard of for Celtic. And so I think his hand was forced in the end, because there's no doubt in 60 he'd said to Jock Stein, no, I think you've gone as far as you possibly can here, and we'll go along with Jimmy McGrory, grooming Sean as his eventual replacement. Although we never, I asked Sean about that. I said, was this discussed with you? And he said he never ever once mentioned to me that you are going to be the next Celtic manager. It was never an official promise. He said that. He said it, everyone telling him in the background that this was going to happen, that he was, the chosen one. He said, but there was never anyone. They said Bob Kelly never ever came and spoke to me and said, that you are the guy that I want to be the next Celtic manager. But the funny thing was, when the change came, he felt very bad about it, and I think that's where all this talk of joint managers or maybe Jock Stein could come in as Sean's assistant, fairly ridiculous suggestions given he was Hibs manager at the time. These came from that because he felt bad, because he thought Sean was going to be angry about it or disappointed, and then he had nothing to worry about. But it was, as I say, there were so many considerations, and in the end it was really the fact that Celtic were losing money. Jimmy McGrory's health was suffering, so he knew that almost for an act of kindness he had to move him upstairs, because everyone that he spoke to about Jimmy McGrory, spoke to Jerry McNee, who did his autobiography, and he said that after he was moved back to the role of public relations, he said he became a different man again. He became the man that everyone knew and loved, because he'd really started to suffer his physical and his mental well-being right through the early 60s. It started to really get to him, and even though he had no direct control over the team, he really was suffering. So it was, and the funny thing was that after 65, Bob Kelly became an excellent chairman. He really was. And Jock Stein, in Jock Stein's office there were 3 pictures. 2 were of the 65 Cup final team, and 1 was of Bob Kelly. He really loved Bob Kelly. There was a real affection there between Bob Kelly, Jock Stein and Sean Fallon. They used to sit together after games just talking things over, and Jock Stein was very clever. He gave Bob Kelly his place. He would make sure that he would speak to him and involve him in discussion, not give him any say, but he would involve him, and he would make sure he was always, kept in the loop, and he would talk things over, but always been a clever diplomat and making him seem like he was involved, but actually not making decisions anymore. And that was a crucial thing, because if you look at it again, we're maybe jumping ahead of ourselves, but the period from 65 to 72, after Bob Kelly's passed away, and you're starting to get the Macari sold, and then the Davy Hayes and all these kind of guys, Celtic wasn't a selling club, and that would never really been the case before. You'd players who were in massive demand, especially Jinky and Bobby Murdoch and these guys, big clubs coming in for them, and they didn't cash in, which was something that Celtic just hadn't done before, and really haven't done too often since. You can maybe say around the Seville time when they kept Larson was maybe a year or two there, but that was because anyone's talking about Celtic just now being, we're going back to we're a selling club now. Celtic has pretty much always been a selling club. You had the podcast we were talking about Celtic trying to sell McGrory when he was at the peak of his powers, and that was just what Celtic did. They just tried to sell their best players, except for in that great period between 65 and then Macari going, and that was the start, beginning, and the end, really.
We seek him here, we seek him there, never to find is very rare. You can go to any single country in the world and you'll find dedicated followers of Celtic.
The favourite ever player has got to be Tommy Burns, who was just totally Celtic class, and in fact he made the class. The way he played, the way he supported the club, the way he lived his life, just everything was just class.
You never hide his colours, cause these colours they don't run, cause he's a dedicated follower.
My early memories of supporting the Celts was as a young boy growing up in the Gorbals. Me and my 2 older brothers, every Saturday Celtic were at home, would walk for the Gorbals, up through Brigton, up the London Road, straight to the Celtic end. Because I was so smart, I used to get a lift over. I can't actually remember what the first game was, but I know Celtic won, because I remember my brothers dancing and hugging each other. Once said Tim, always said Tim.
Throughout the years, we've had our times, 9 in a row, with Buckfast wine.
It's probably more of a regret than a confession, but the aforementioned Dundee United game, I think walking up towards Parkhead, one of the street hawkers were selling t-shirts, and this one with a picture of Liam Brady. So a picture of Liam Brady in the t-shirt. Liam Brady, the legend begins. And unfortunately, I think I lost that on purpose maybe the following year, and I really regret it now, because it would still fit me and it'd be a collector's item.
And he's a dedicated follower of Celtic. Oh yes he is. Oh yes he is. Oh yes he is. Oh yes he is. County Clare to Singapore of China.
Now, my life, I was born 2 streets down from Celtic Park, 1919, and I love Celtic. My dad was a season ticket holder, and then everything goes through all that life. And I've seen Charlie Tully, I've seen Paddy Connelly, and another player called Peter McGonigal. I've seen him playing. In an international game, and a guy called Sammy Crooks was an England player, and he hit him at Celtic Park and he put him nearly up the tunnel back in.
It's funny when you look at the whole decade of the 60s, and we're all very, very romantic and starry-eyed when we talk about the 60s, but just to put a little bit of emphasis on the difference whenever Jock Stein came in to the club. During the 1960s, we won 20 trophies, and up until Jock Stein came in, we won 3 of those trophies, and they were, 2 Glasgow Cups and 1 Glasgow Charity Cup.
Yep.
So when you put that into perspective, all the other trophies came after Jock Stein arrived.
And that's it. I mean, you look at as I say, the season we mentioned, the 1960 season, 34 matches played, 12-1. That's just an absolutely disgraceful record. Then you look to the 66-67 season, just not that far off after, and you've got the clean sweep, you've got, I think it was 196 goals scored. It's just, the turnaround was absolutely monumental, it was just absolutely huge, and the changes were fairly small, if certainly in terms of personnel, but the little things that he did, remember that, I said to Sean, what changed in such a short period of time? What did Jock Stein do? And I think it was discipline, and it was confidence. That were the 2 words used, discipline and confidence. He said he came in and he said he'd come back from Dunfermline, and speaking to Jock Stein's son George, he confirmed this. He said the time at Dunfermline just gave him so much confidence, and he came back ready to be Celtic manager, ready to take on, if you like, Bob Kelly, and say, look, I'm here to pick this team. I deserve to pick this team because I've turned Dunfermline from a team that was going down, almost certainly been relegated, to a team that was playing in Europe and beating some of the best teams in the continent.
I know, it was absolutely dramatic, because when you look at the fact that Jock Stein became Celtic manager on the 9th of March 1965, and still then they won their first trophy on the 24th of April.
It's amazing. I mean, I would as well, I suppose I would do this, but I would point out the work that Sean had done at that stage. Sean Fallon had done some terrific groundwork. He had brought in, he provided Jock Stein with some terrific tools. He had all the raw ingredients, if you like, and he had just brought in Bertie Auld. Now, I know some people give Jock Stein credit for Bertie Auld, but if you read the book, you'll find out why that's not the case. Ronnie Simpson had been brought in from, he'd taken him from Jock Stein and told him he was looking at signing him as a reserve, and got bartered down the price to £2,000, and he had got these terrific players in, everyone in the Lions bar, Willie Wallace was there. Sean had also been trying to sign, which I found out from Joe McBride, on 3 separate occasions, and each time the board let him down. So Sean tried to sign Joe McBride in 1959, and then tried to sign him twice after, and was on each occasion the Celtic board refused to match the bids of Wolves and then Thistle, and then they wouldn't pay Motherwell exactly what they paid them the next year. Once Jock Stein insisted, they paid the money, and Joe McBride would have made a big difference. There's no doubt about it, because again, he was a personality, and he was a guy who had a bit of arrogance about him, who believed he was just born to score goals. So you had the building blocks were there. You needed someone, a personality, who could come in and just... Celtic was dysfunctional, really. You had a manager who wasn't a manager. You had a chairman who was picking the team but wasn't accountable. He wasn't in there. He was making changes every single week. I think the change I mentioned about Jinky being dropped for the cup final, that meant that the 5-man attack for that cup final was the 39th different permutation of that season in all competitions.
Wow.
That's just ridiculous, 39 permutations. And so you have this, you needed someone to come in, really, a football man. And the thing about Jock Stein was, people make it because of the fantastic, stylish way, attacking way they won in Lisbon. You know, that Jock Stein was almost like a football romantic, and he was a pragmatist at heart, Jock Stein, and he'd gone to Dunfermline. Funny enough, the only criticism of him at Dunfermline, which came from his successor there, was that he was a defensive manager. Mm-hmm. He was a successful manager, but he was too defensive. His successor, Cunningham at Dunfermline, said that he'd freed Dunfermline because they continued to be a good side after Stein left. He'd freed them from Stein's, defensive shackles, which seems amazing when you think about the way Celtic won in Lisbon and the teams that he built through all those years. But he was very much a pragmatist, and anything that he thought wouldn't serve the team, including Jinky at the start, he was not in favour of. So but he was exactly the right man. He needed someone like that, because if they had promoted, as I say, hopefully you'll see in the book that Sean Fallon was a guy who could have been a good manager somewhere. He really could have been. He had all the attributes in a lot of respects, and he did some tremendous things for Celtic. But at that time, it really helped Jock Stein that he had been out at Dunfermline, been out at Hibs, and had the personality and the way to come in and say, look, I should get full control of this team because I deserve full control, because I've shown elsewhere that I can wield control and I can do good things for this club, as I've done elsewhere. And he could prove that. He'd shown it. He'd shown he deserved it. And even then, at the start, Bob Kelly still tried to interfere. So, because I said to Sean, I said, what would you have done? I said, you obviously had to have fought Bob Kelly in a certain way to get control. And he said, yeah, he said, no doubt I would. He said, but the thing was, Celtic needed a fresh face. Mm-hmm. And Sean was quite aware of that. He'd had some problems, because there are some players, the only criticism really of players ever that worked with Sean I came across was about the early 60s, and that he didn't do more to improve training, he didn't do more to just turn the team's fortunes around.
Was that the type of environment that he was used to at that stage, though, Stephen? Because that is, of course, the criticism that's levied at Jimmy McGrory too. Yeah, and that's, I put it to Sean, and he said, I should have done more. That was one of his regrets. He said, I should have done more. But there were complicated relationships at that point. As I say, Jimmy McGrory was not himself at that stage. He was not involved, but he knew that there were things going on. He knew that Sean had been identified as the successor, not through Sean's doing, not because Sean had been touting himself for the job in any way. Before Jock Stein left, Sean hadn't wanted the job. He hadn't wanted the job at that stage. He came to want it. I think he felt that if he got control, he could really make a difference. But at that stage, he certainly wasn't touting himself for the job. He hadn't been lobbying Bob Kelly or anyone to get the job. But Jimmy McGrory saw that this guy was his heir, and he was there, and he was in the shadows, and he was almost waiting to take over. And so it was difficult, because Sean tried to. There's various clips in the early 60s about the players arriving for the first day of pre-season, and there'd been a ball for every player, which was just revolutionary in those days. Mm-hmm. But Jimmy McGrory started to get a bit. He wasn't too happy with Sean, and he said, that it seems like you're trying to take over here a little bit. And he said, just remember, I'm the manager. And the thing was that Jimmy McGrory had been, despite the fact he was continually undermined by Bob Kelly, he'd been the hero to Bob Kelly. Bob Kelly just idolised him as a player. And Sean felt, if I get on this guy's wrong side and it becomes a choice between Jimmy McGrory or me for Bob Kelly, I'll be the one that goes. He would have been out.
Yeah, and the thing is as well that Sean Fallon, Jock Stein was a born manager. He when he realised he wasn't going to become manager at Celtic, he did exactly the right thing. He left for Dunfermline and he forged his reputation. Sean Fallon was a born Celtic servant. Becoming manager wasn't the be-all and end-all to him, because I said, would you not have been better seeing how badly things were, how dysfunctional it was? Would you not have been better going out? Because some of the players that worked with him at that time, the John Gorman, said if Sean had gone down to England, he would have been a success, and he could have maybe come back to Celtic with his hands strengthened and done. And he said, I just didn't want to leave Celtic. He said it wasn't about being a manager for me. It was about my dream had been to be part of Celtic. That has been my dream since I was a boy. He said it wasn't about being a manager. It was about being part of Celtic. I could never bring myself to voluntarily leave Celtic, and that was what it was all about. And that was the positive thing, that when it came to 65, everyone thought that Sean would be so put out about it. And Bob Kelly was really nervous about telling him. Jock Stein was very nervous when they had the meeting through in Edinburgh. but they had nothing really to worry about, because although Sean by that stage wanted the job, he wanted Celtic to be successful more, and he saw that Jock Stein... Sean had always been a massive Jock Stein fan anyway. He'd made him his vice-captain when no one else thought anything of him, when he wasn't even hardly in the team, when all other players were laughing at him. Sean had always seen that there was something special in Jock Stein, so he was more than ready to say, this guy's a fresh face, he's what Celtic needs, he's got all the qualities. Yeah, of course I can work with him, of course I'll work with him. And that was the backdrop, because, and that was why as well, as soon as it was ever mentioned, the joint manager thing, because I asked about that, he said, that was never mentioned to me, and he said if it had been, I would have said that's absolute rubbish. He said, because you need someone in complete control. And he said Jock Stein was exactly the right man to do that. He said he was exactly what Celtic needed, and so it proved. But it took someone selfless like Sean to step back, because a lot of people would have been embarrassed by that, I think, maybe put out, when everyone knew that you're the man who's going to be the manager, and then suddenly you're not, and you're the number two. I think a lot of people would have been embarrassed, but he was more than ready and more than willing to step back and just work with Jock Stein.
In the summer of 1959, Celtic purchased a new area of land for the first time since 1897, when they had bought the land upon which Celtic Park was built. This new area of land was not far from Celtic Park. Indeed, it was only a few hundred yards east along London Road. Following the purchase, work immediately started on laying out red blaze pitches to establish a training ground at Barrowfield for the club to use even when Celtic Park's grass pitch was frozen. This was just the latest investment in the infrastructure at Celtic, and to fund the ongoing changes, Celtic launched the Celtic Pools in 1964. Rangers and Dundee United had both started similar ventures and had proven successful, and with Celtic's launch it was anticipated to do likewise. The Pools game idea was simple. Each entry would be given a list of numbers. Those numbers would correspond to football teams playing that week. Prizes would be given out following certain guidelines across those fixtures, for instance the line of teams with the highest total of goals scored. There were benefits to being a Pools agent as well. The agents were responsible for collecting the money from Pools players in the local area. If they had enough people signed up to play every week, they would receive their season book at Celtic for free. Agents were also eligible to receive prize money themselves should any of their players win. Although the Celtic Pools was a relative success, and still runs to this day, it was not without issue. With a rival Pools game across the city often offering much higher value prizes, at one point the difference was £10,000 to £100,000 for the top prize, it was not unheard of for arguments to break out within families as to which of the clubs they should be helping to fund, as some Celtic supporters attempted to win the higher prize on the Rangers Pools. The value of the Celtic Pools to the club did not take long in showing itself. In 1966, the north enclosure was extensively renovated. The terracing was upgraded to concrete, while the iconic hayshed roof was once more replaced. Gone was the farmyard look and one nickname, but that was quickly replaced by another as the Celtic fans took to their new home, the Jungle. 1968 also saw the East Terracing receive similar treatment to its western counterpart by the installation of a roof. However, while the West Terracing's roof only covered the back of the stand, the East Terracing's roof covered the whole of the standing area. In between the roof works at Celtic Park, the city of Glasgow was undergoing its own changes. To the northwest of the stadium, just off the Gallagate, the Camwache Twin Towers were built in 1967. Multi-storey flats were becoming commonplace in Glasgow as a solution to the housing shortages within the city after the Second World War. Throughout the 1960s, many towering schemes were built in places like the Gorbals, Maryhill, Pinkston and Springburn. The Red Road flats in Balornock were perhaps the most famous of the buildings, but none stood quite as tall as the Gallagate Twins. At 298 feet, 109 Bluevale Street and 51 Whitevale Street were the tallest of all of the new multi-stories, although fell just short of the Tate Towers Glasgow record of 300 feet. The Twin Towers also suffered from the same issue as their New York counterparts built around the same time. While the World Trade Center may have been significantly taller, the Manhattan Wind meant an inner steel tube design. The Camwache Towers instead utilised an almost unique hydraulic jack system to combat swaying in the wind. Sadly, the multi-storey towers cropping up throughout Glasgow were done cheaply with bad design. By Celtic's 125th anniversary, many of the towers had been pulled down. In November 2011, it was announced that the Camlachie Towers would be joining that list and are scheduled for demolition following the Red Road estate demolitions.
And with the cup final victory in '65, the decision had been vindicated.
Sean, I think there was a phrase in one of the books that Stein was the right man over Fallon because he wasn't tainted by complacency. I think it was in the Andy Dugan book, and I think that's a fair comment because it was almost perception. You know, Jock Stein was coming in as this guy who had been successful. He just had an aura of success about him, and right from the start, Sean said, right from the start, the players believed in him. He said they saw him and they believed what he told them. And when he said, if you play to your best, you'll beat anyone, they believed him, and they just had so that. And when it came, as I say, the '65 Cup final, they were down. They were, and the Fairmont were the favourites. They were, I think, 12 points ahead of Celtic at that stage. They'd beaten them in the various occasions previously, and the Celtic were down in the match, and they came back, and that just whether that would have happened in previous cup finals, you're not sure. And it was, I think Stein said it was such an important psychological victory because they'd get so used to losing in cup finals, and so to come and to, what was the line? Parkhead is paradise once more, and they were winners then. They weren't losers. They were the winners, and they could go on and then they could start getting stuck into Rangers because that was the next barrier, the next psychological barrier to overcome was this inferiority complex with Rangers. So. And then sure enough, another cup final presents itself.
Even though Dunfermline then played them 4 days later and walloped them 5-1
and that's the thing,
after the cup final.
But that was almost a useful thing in itself because I think the players, and when you speak to the players about that, Billy McNeill said, look, the club was improving at that point. He said had Stein not come in, he said if Sean had been able to get control, he's quite confident that Celtic would have been successful. But he said at that point Celtic were so used, even in the 50s, and you went over it yourself, all the talent the team had, they were almost content to win a league every 7-8 years, a cup every couple of years, and that was almost seen as acceptable. And after, when Celtic lost to Dunfermline, was it 5-1 or something, they got absolutely hammered by Dunfermline straight after the cup final. And Jock Stein apparently just went through the players. I think he'd never seen anything like it before. And he said, look, I've not come here to win a trophy once every 10 years. I want to win every match and every trophy going. And I think that made as much of an impression on the players as winning the cup final and the reaction to that, because it was seen that, no, it's not good enough to win a cup final and then relax in your next game. Your standards need to be higher than that. And that was the way the club was run from then on, and it wasn't a case of, because inconsistency had been the big thing. It was seen as being good enough to entertain and to be this team, and also they complained a lot. They complained about bad luck and bad refereeing decisions, and the thing about Bob Kelly would say that the cup finals were lost because the players believed there was a jinx on them, and there was just always excuses with Celtic. And Stein, that was Stein came in and said no excuses, no talking about the referee, no one saying we need to make the referee an irrelevance in the game. We need to make sure that whatever happens we win. And that was the mentality that just became central to the club going forward.
I don't think you're going to fit into this podcast very well with statements like that, Stephen.
No, I know. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there was nothing to the complaints, and there absolutely was. But I think Stein was absolutely right. If you just become a victim, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You create this kind of victim status around you. Oh, it's a referee again, and then sure enough, then that just happens next time, and it becomes acceptable. If you give, I remember Jim Craig, used to work with the Celtic, and he I remember talking about a penalty shootout. I think Birmingham City were involved in it, and Trevor Francis was moaning about the end that Birmingham were shooting into the opposition fans. He was moaning about it, and he was saying you should never do that. You should never give a footballer an excuse to fail. He said, because they'll take it. He said that's the thing. He said the mentality is you should just don't give them an excuse, and don't go about referees. He said make it clear that victory is expected and demanded. And I thought that was fascinating, you know, and it's always something that stayed with me, and I think it's no doubt come from his time with Stein. There's no excuse. You know, you go out and you win, no matter what happens. If the referee's disgraceful, you win.
Well, I thought the most important game in my career was 65.
The Scottish Cup final?
Yeah, because we hadn't really won an awful lot, and it was Jock's first trophy, and we knew it was going to be a difficult game, and Dunfermline were a very good team. But like every Celtic team, you know, you've always got that wee bit more confidence or arrogance, whatever you want to call it. And we came back twice to draw level, and then, as you can remember, Billy shoved me out the road because I'd already scored two, and else it was winning my hat-trick.
I was going to say, everybody remembers it as Billy McNeil's Scottish Cup final, but it was actually Bertie Auld that scored 2 goals in that game, wasn't it?
Yeah, but as I say, the great thing about that, even that squad and then the 67 team, we had so many match winners, so many goal scorers, and so many with a presence. You mentioned Billy, who was a captain, but with Bobby Murdoch, who was a tremendous leader, and as far as I was concerned was the best player. With Jimmy Johnson, who was one of the best entertainers in the game, so, you know, and also goal scorers, you know. So
that's an interesting question you bring up, Bobby Murdoch, and I was just reading something recently in the past couple of years that team had 2 world-class players. Obviously they were talking about Jimmy Johnson and Bobby Murdoch. Bobby Murdoch was a world-class player, not just a great player, but an actual world-class player.
I don't know what you class a world-class player, but one thing we had, if you speak about people down south, the likes of Bobby Charlton and such like, they mentioned Bobby Lennox. You know what I mean?
Right.
And we could go on and on. I thought the biggest and the best player in the world was our left back was Tommy Gemmell. You know what I mean?
I've heard that.
And we had the old feather that just sat at the back and shouted and bawled and gave us a wee bit of stick was Ronnie Simpson. So we all were part to play, and what we did have was a tremendous balance. You know, I say Murdoch was the best player because that was my opinion. I say Jinky was the best entertainer because here again, that was my opinion. But if you says to me, was anyone better than Willie Wallace, Stevie Chalmers? John Clark, without doubt, was the most person that had dictated to other teams. So they were all very important. Jim Craig came in as a young man, but to play in front of Jimmy and very seldom get the ball off of Jimmy, that must have been difficult. To think you were going out there to run for 90 minutes without getting a touch of the ball. Well, I must admit that we get tremendous praise. Both these players mentioned Murdy and myself, and the same as the Barcelona players. But the big thing is to be a good player, you must have off the ball players. But I think that Johnson, if he'd have been given the same freedom as what Messi gets at this particular moment. Jimmy was recognised in the days you had a system and you played to the system, a load of crap, because Jimmy could play anywhere in the park and be a standout. Jimmy Johnson had to work off the ball as well as on it. So yeah, we've got similarities. Now, I don't care what anyone says. Some people say, but Murdoch and I wouldn't have been as commanding because it was a different era. There's no substitute for ability. It doesn't matter what you do or what profession you have. And not being egotistical, but we had ability.
And even though the Scottish Cup final of 65 is iconic in the Celtic history, and this was the start of the Stein era and the golden era that Celtic enjoyed through the 60s and the 70s, when you read a little bit about those early years of Stein's reign, it wasn't the Scottish Cup final that all the players and Jock Stein thought where they saw a springboard. It was the League Cup final, as you say earlier on, when they actually defeated Rangers.
Absolutely, and I mean, if you've ever read Archie Macpherson's book on Stein, he makes clear how much Stein wanted Rangers. I mean, there were personal reasons there as well. I think the way he'd been treated in his hometown, but he knew that if Celtic could get the upper hand in Rangers, that's half the battle. You know, it's more than half the battle. And okay, the 65 beating Dunfermline, that was great, you'd won a trophy, but again, you could go back to the situation of the 50s where Celtic would win the odd trophy and they would be a great team to watch and they had great individual players, but that wasn't good enough. It really wasn't good enough, and Stein wanted to make that clear. And if you ever watched the 65 Cup final, one of the first things that happened is Ian Young just absolutely clatters Willie Johnson in the first few minutes, and I think that was just because Celtic had always been this team that had an almost kind of puritanical view. Bob Kelly wanted them to be, you know, just the clean sportsman and, you know, playing the game with dignity, losing with dignity. And again, that's all very nice, but I remember Bertie Auld saying that with the big difference when Jock Stein came in, he said the big difference was we were given the chance to compete. He said before, if you tried to win the ball, you went through someone, you just weren't appreciated at Celtic. And he said that was the difference that Jock Stein said, no, it's a 50-50 ball, we want you to win it. And we know you have to be a bit nasty now and again. And that was what they needed in Old Firm games, because they were bullied by Rangers. Really, Rangers were always a big physical team. And the team Rangers had in the early 60s was a really good team. But Rangers would always bully Celtic, and they just had that aura of, you know, being able to come in and swagger in and take the trophies. You know, and I think that, you know, there was that needed to change, and that Ian Young tackle, I think a lot of the players speak about that, setting the tone for that game, because it was a really, I think, quite a dirty game. But Celtic won, and that was all that mattered, you know, that they came out with the trophy, and it just laid down a marker. And then I think there was another Old Firm game, a Glasgow Cup. Again, you think the Glasgow Cup has been not too important, but Celtic won 4-0 in the final of that, and that just, again, that would just stretched it just showed that the balance of power had changed, and they had. And I know that I think there was John Gregg said you used to feel you were playing against 12 men when Celtic had Stein, and I think that became the feeling that there was the inferiority complex switched that Rangers always felt. He said you could come in lead, you know, Rangers could come in leading at half time in an Old Firm game, but you knew that Stein was in the next dressing room getting the players going. You knew what he'd be, and it's a nice thing to think of, you know, that to know that you've got a guy who's so feared by the opposition, and just everything started to work. Then it was, as I say, from being dysfunctional, everyone started doing their jobs really well. You had this great manager, you had the talent there that Sean had brought in, you know, that he'd brought in all these lions, the future lions who were great players, so you had all the talent there. Bob Kelly started being a chairman, which if he just did the chairman's job, he was fine. And Sean Fallon, as I say, was a terrific assistant. I'm biased, but he really was an absolutely perfect assistant, in the words of Davy Hay. So you had everything working well after 65. Everything right from the start was working well, and just small changes. Just everything started coming together. Because again, even the backroom staff, things were already. You know, Neely Mockin had come in the year before in '64. So he was there. You're not telling me Neely Mockin's not a good coach, but he wasn't. It wasn't until Stein came in that he started, you know, showing what he could do, making the team the fittest team in Europe, and, you know, running Inter off the pitch in the final in '67. So you had the building blocks. Bob Rooney was there as well. Everything was there, and it just took Stein to just get things working, just get everything working well, and then taking on Rangers, getting the upper hand in Rangers, and from then on. It's and again, talking about Stein the pragmatist, look at the '66 New Year game when they won 5-1 and Stevie Chalmers scored the hat trick. Again, he'd sent the players out that day in you know, Adidas Sambas basically, you know, with plimsolls, and because he saw that the ground was frozen. And again, that's just smart thinking. It's not anything revolutionary. It's just common sense. And Rangers players were leaden-footed, and Celtic were all over them. And that was just typical of things that were going to go on from then on in.
And do you think when Jock Stein took over this team and they won the Scottish Cup, then they won the League Cup, and we could talk about cups all night long here and have a 24-hour podcast, but when you seen the success that he started to bring very quickly, was it at that early stage that Stein started to think about Europe?
Absolutely, yeah. He did. I mean, that was one thing that's really impressive. Actually, it's not that Stein came in, and you see managers these days when they're appointed, and they'll come in and they'll they'll play down expectations and they'll try and build up. Right from the start, he was saying Celtic are going to be a force again. And as soon as they won the cups, it was right. We won the league. As soon as they won the league, and he said the measure of any great team these days is in Europe. That's where great teams are judged.
Mm-hmm.
And he was really, really ambitious from the start, and that it went right through the squad. I think Bobby Murdoch said he often wondered whether Stein had taken something from, obviously Muhammad Ali was coming up at that stage, and the whole "I am the greatest." Just people start to believe it. Your opponents start to believe it, and the guys. He said certainly the guys in the dressing room, after a while, said, "Yeah, he's right. We can if we play." He said the line was always, "If you play to your best, no one can live with you." And he said we believed that. We genuinely believed it, and it showed out in the park. And he said it did turn into an arrogance, and an arrogance is not a bad thing to have. And that was again something that Sean was quite open about, that Jock Stein had, that Sean didn't have, was arrogance. Mm-hmm. And he said sometimes that is a really good thing to have. You need a balance. It's not good to have too much arrogance, and it's good to have people around you who can temper that a bit. But he said that Jock Stein certainly had an ego and an arrogance that made him just a force of nature, and someone that no one could ignore, and that people just followed instinctively. As soon as he came in, there was people saying, "Well, if training started at 10, we'd be there at 9," because there wasn't expected, but he just wanted to please him. He's just one of these guys that the players just wanted to impress instinctively, even if some of them hated him. They wanted to earn his approval, and you see that with a lot of the great managers, the Cloughs and the Shankleys and things. Not all the players really liked him all the time, but they always craved their approval.
From 1960 to 1962, the Celtic home kit was green and white hoops with a white collar and white cuffs. This was worn with white shorts and socks, which were mainly green, apart from one thick white hoop around the ankle. In 1963, the most iconic Celtic shirt ever was introduced. This green and white hoop shirt, which in 4 years' time would cement a pack of lines forever in our history. This style of shirt would remain untouched for this decade. The Celtic home kit from December 62 to May 63 was complemented with a white collar trim, white shorts and white socks. From 1963 to 1965, the shirt was complemented with white shorts, and the socks were mainly green, apart from two thick white hoops, one around the ankle and one just below the knee.
Good evening, San Diego. News Bulletin for the 5th of August 1962. I'm Ron Turquoise. Hollywood's queen, Marilyn Monroe, has been found dead in her apartment. At just 36 years of age, psychologists say her zest for life must have just fizzled out. She leaves behind a gleaming career, 23 films, revenues of $200 million, and not to say, 3 very lonely ex-husbands. I was going to say this off air, but I have to say it now. Let us not forget that iconic white skirt fluttering, some may say billowing in the wind. Now over to Chuck McFadden with the weather. What's the forecast, Chuck?
Only Mr. Bobby Lennox. Bobby, absolutely great to talk to you.
Good morning, nice to see you.
So you signed for James McGrory at the time, and it was pretty lean at that stage. I mean, Celtic weren't going through a particularly good period in their history. Tell us a wee bit about the early days of what it was actually like to be at Celtic Park.
Well, Mr. McGrory was the manager. Training was just out in the morning, running around the park, and running around the park, and then maybe changing, running the other way, sort of thing. And things were just, I think the directors picked a team. It wasn't that a manager picked a team, sort of thing. So you could actually, the boys tell all the stories. You could go in the match day and you see your boots lying out at number 8 and think, great, I'm playing today. Get back in 20 minutes later and maybe number 11 and think, I'm moving. Then get back in at 2 o'clock and the boots are away, playing at all. So it was a very mismatch sort of thing, and so it was difficult. But then once the gaffer came, once Mr. Stein came, it was completely different. And then I just got into the team in the January really, and Big Jock came in the March, so I'd scored a few goals and I was starting to think to myself, a wee chance here. I'd been there 4 years and served what I thought was a good apprenticeship in the reserve team, but when the gaffer came, you're thinking, well, new gaffer, might not fancy me, I could be out. But when he came, I scored another couple of goals, and Bertie just came into the team and we got a wee bit of partnership going, so that was me from then on. I was really more or less in the team.
What was it like when he came into the dressing room? I mean, did you know you were getting into the team, even right into the European Cup final, or did we always guess no matter what game it was?
Oh, you could score a hat-trick today and not in the team next Saturday. You know, at that time Big Jock just ruled an iron fist. He was great for all the guys. He moved Bobby Murdoch from inside right sort of to midfield, brought Bertie from a left winger to a midfield player, and told Big Tommy get forward as much as you can, and John Clark in beside Billy. He was just great at what he'd done. He was way before his time. He was great.
Were the players in awe of Jock Stein?
Definitely. Yeah. When he first came, he'd won the cup with Dunfermline, he'd beaten Hibs and won the Summer Cup. I think they beat Barcelona or something like that at Easter Road. And when he came, it was an awe. You know, what he said was law. If Big Jock said it was a fact. It was right. Right or wrong, it was right.
He always sort of gives you the impression, you know, obviously being a supporter, you don't see behind the scenes, but he always got the impression that he was a very cold man. You know, and as you say, what he said went. Was there personal moments as well? You know, did he put his arm around your shoulder sometimes and say, "Come on, Bobby"?
He could bury in the dressing room. He could come in and bury in the dressing room. You're not doing this, you're not doing that, and etc. Other days you could get a hold and say, "By the way, if you're not playing, we're not playing. You know, we need you to do this. We need you to do." It was great at that kind of thing. And after the games, if we maybe away from home in Europe after the game, maybe in a bus going back to the airport or something, say, right, let's get the sing-song started. You loved this sing-song.
Was that right?
Oh, I loved this sing-song. and the day after the game, maybe a home European Cup tie, we come in the next morning at 11 o'clock, and we had a huge bath at Celtic Park, and it'd be full of bubbles, and him, Jimmy Steele, Bob Rooney and Sean Fallon with massage, got the 2 massage tables out, boys would be singing in the bath, and everything in the garden was rosy. Then the next day, he was a gaffer again.
Is that right?
Everything was that. The fun bit was back. We won that game. We've had a bit of fun. Right, lads, prepare for Saturday.
On the training ground, was it fun or was it hard work or was it both?
Both.
Did he enjoy? Did he join in with the crack going on and stuff?
Oh, he could. It depends what kind of mood he was in. If we went up to the training ground, and maybe say Wally Fernie or Neil Morecambe was taking the training, we'd do all we're doing a wee bit. But as soon as the Mercedes drove into the car park, upper pace, and that was the deliberate. It just seemed me. Everybody just seemed me go a bit quicker and do it because there's the gaffer in, and it wasn't a deliberate thing. But he liked a bit of fun. I mean, he really did. He could enjoy himself.
Did anybody ever argue with him?
I don't know when that funeral was. One or two guys maybe try to make a point to him, but he was nearly always. He was a gaffer, and if he said it, we done it. You know, it was just as simple as that. The first night it really came to what we thought about was we played Zurich in Glasgow in the first round of the European Cup and beat them 2-0. We went to Zurich and on a small room, I think it was maybe Billy's room, in a small bedroom, all the team calmed down and Big Jock says, we're going to play tonight exactly the same way we played in Glasgow. And Billy kind of said that night, well, they're the home team, boss, they're coming to go to us, you know, I mean, do you think we should maybe sit back, blah, 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 blah. And the guy says, they've not got the ability to come and go to us, we're better than them, we're going to do exactly what I say we're going to do. And we beat them 3-0.
Yeah.
And it was never questioned again, what he said just went.
Talking about the European Cup, obviously Celtic were the first sort of non-Latin team to win the European Cup. Was it always his ambition to win the European Cup, or is that something that sort of progressed?
It was a definite next game, man. You know, if we were playing Motherwell on Saturday, nothing else mattered except beat Motherwell on Saturday. We're playing whoever next Wednesday night. That didn't count until the Saturday game was by. It was definitely a one game at a time. And in actual fact, the European Cup was, we're going to Zurich. Like, me, Jimmy and I would be groomed up all the time. All the time. I mean, we're going to Zurich. What do we like Zurich? It'll be a nice place, with the snow on the hills and all that kind of stuff, you know. Then we went to Nantes, and that was another experience. We went to France. Then we're going to, where did we go next? Vojvodina, I think it was. Oh, that's just great. Look where we are now. It was just going somewhere different with the team was just great for us, you know. We're away together and we're playing these foreign teams. It was great.
Just like a field trip out of school then?
Type of thing, you know what I mean? That's that type of thing. This is great fun. We're doing a job we love. We're travelling abroad. We're seeing places we've never been before. Seeing new stadiums. It was great.
So it seems like such a change in football at that time, because no one really dreamt of winning the European Cup at that stage.
Right. It really costs every game at a time. I mean, the only time I think he really spoke about it was when we got to the final. He's going to make history, lads. It's going to be, you'll be for the rest of your life, you'll be the first team ever to win it. But that was the only time we ever talked about the European Cup, was once we qualified for the final.
Yeah. So obviously, winning the European Cup final in Lisbon was fantastic. All the fans come on the pitch. Does Big Billy ever get a bit of stick about the only one lifting the trophy up?
Big Billy tells a good story about that. We're actually in the dressing room, and the dressing room was a horrible dressing room. It was like a big eye. At the top of the dressing room, and the top of the eye, there were 5 pegs, and then there was showers down the middle. Then the bottom 7 or 8 pegs, so the defenders changed at one end, the forwards changed it, and we never really seen much each other. It would actually be 10 minutes at least in the dressing room before somebody said, "Where's Billy? Where's the cup?" But Billy had to go back across, as everybody knows, to get the cup. And they got the presentation. Then he had to wait till the policemen that were taking him back across get a photos taken of the European Cup without Billy in the photo. They pushed Billy to the side, all got a photograph taken of the cup. So, but it was ages. It must have been 20 minutes after the final before he came in.
And was everybody just sitting around waiting? Was it champagne on ice, or
we didn't drink champagne. We drank lager.
Aye, there you go.
That's your fact. I'd say a few of the boys didn't even drink it that time.
Really?
It was amazing. Yeah. But it was ages before the cup came in.
Did it dawn on you at that stage just what you had achieved?
No, I don't think anybody realised what we'd done. We'd beaten Inter Milan and we'd won the European Cup. I don't think we realised how great it was. We'll go back to Glasgow, because every street was full, every corner you passed in the bus was. And we got to Celtic Park with 60,000 in the stadium just to see us parading the cup. Yeah.
And it's a perfect time to bring up Bill Shankly, because in '66 obviously we got to the Cup Winners' Cup semi-final and played this great Shankly Liverpool team, and although Celtic beat them 1-0 in the first leg, they lost the second leg 2-0 down in Anfield, and that, excuse the pun, was a battle.
It was, and again it's always famous or infamous for the Bobby Lennox goal that was disallowed, and was so crucial to Celtic going out. And it seems that Celtic were the better team over the 2 legs, and then the thing was as well, the final was at Hampden that year, so there was a real feeling that was Celtic's trophy. If they could just get past Liverpool, the final, they'd basically have home advantage in the final, and it was their trophy. Again, the funny what if, I suppose, is had they won it, would they have been as hungry the next year? You'd like to think they would have been. You don't know how it would have affected them, because it was all, and that was something that became clear, I think, in 1970, was that part of the Lisbon, part of the kind of backdrop, it was the almost innocence and the of the team, the way they played the game, just with that kind of spirit. They were the underdogs. They went into everything hungry, determined. Whereas in 70, as everyone knows, Feyenoord were the team who were the underdogs, and Celtic were the maybe slightly arrogant favourites.
That's why I asked the question, because I often think back to that battle against Liverpool and wondered, was that one of the spurs that drove Stein on for the following year? And he'd got his taste of European football and our European success. Okay, we got beaten in the semi-final, but to think that night, against of all people, Bill Shankly, and we all know the classic quote when Bill, that Bill Shankly said about Jock Stein, you're immortal, John, and all this here kind of stuff. I just wondered, was that night the night where he went, hold on a minute, I've got bigger fish to fry with this team?
Yeah, whether that was that night, I know that they certainly, they were, as you say, great pals, Bill Shankly and Jock Stein, but I know they certainly fell out that night, and that he wasn't entirely happy with the way Liverpool had gone through, more so with the ref than with Shankly and his team, but I think he wasn't at all, he didn't leave Anfield in good terms with Bill Shankly. But I think Jock Stein had his eye on the European Cup from the start, which might seem remarkable, but you think back to his time with Dunfermline, he took them in some fantastic European runs, and they didn't have anywhere near the quality of player that he inherited at Celtic. So he came to Celtic experiencing European football, and with a fair grasp of what was needed, and he must have been really energised and buoyed by his experiences at Dunfermline, because it showed them what was possible. They were beating some absolutely tremendous teams at Dunfermline, Valencia and Everton, and some of the best teams in Europe. So he must have seen that was possible. And he'd seen as well with Celtic that even Celtic, being as disorganised as they were and naive at times as they were, could still get to the semi-finals of the Cup Winners' Cup and up against MTK Budapest. So he knew there was talent there. He knew they just needed a bit of guidance, and he was confident enough in himself to believe that he could give them that.
Now, you mentioned Joe McBride earlier on, and the importance of Joe McBride can't be understated either, because with the following season, when they entered the European Cup, Joe McBride was one of the pivotal players in the team, yet he never made it to the final.
I know, and I think that you hope that it was nice to see that he got such great coverage and got such great appreciation. It so often happens when he passed away, unfortunately. And he was a lovely, lovely man, Joe McBride, and a definite Celtic legend. You look at and I do always wonder if they had brought him in earlier, what difference he could have made, because I know Sean said he was just the best finisher he'd ever worked with. He was just so natural. He just any time he never panicked, and that was something that was quite a feature of Celtic's play at that time, was that any time they got the ball around the box, they would panic. I mean, they had guys who were really talented, John Hughes, but could be so frustrating. And at that time, Stevie Chalmers was taking a while to develop as well. He wasn't the player he became. I think he was criticised for being a head-down player by Jimmy Delaney. And you had this guy who was just an assassin. He was just an absolute predator. He just sniffed out goals wherever he went. And even after Celtic decided that he wasn't up to it anymore and his knee just hadn't recovered, he went to Hibs and scored a terrific amount of goals, and Jock Stein even admitted he'd made a mistake in selling him. But the funny thing is, of course, is that the great plan of Jock Stein, when he did bring him in, when they were finally successful in getting Joe McBride in, the great plan was to partner him with Willie Wallace and just basically squeeze out. He wasn't entirely convinced by Stevie Chalmers. So the plan was to have Joe McBride and Willie Wallace as this great front pairing that he told Billy McNeil would be the best in Europe. Mm-hmm. And they ended up, they only played twice together because of Joe's injury. I think the first game they played, they scored 3 goals between them. So you think it could well have been a really spectacular partnership. But then, of course, Stevie Chalmers scored the winning goal in Lisbon, so could you really have wanted it to be any different? But, I mean, Joe McBride, the contribution he made to that season, I remember reading Ronnie Simpson's book at the end of the 67 season, and he said that when they went to Nantes in the earlier rounds, he said that Joe McBride was the superstar of the team. He was known as the Marlon Brando of football, the French journalist called him. They weren't, at that stage, they weren't really interested. After the game, they were raving about Chinky, and they were raving about a couple of other players, but he said coming into the game, Joe McBride was just the Celtic superstar. Everyone was talking about Joe McBride. And it just shows, when you think about all the players, the Murdochs and the Johnstons and the Aulds and the Wally Wallaces that came in later, the Chalmers, that he was the man at that stage. And without his goals, would it have been a clean sweep? Would they have done what they did? You just don't know. But he certainly deserves just immense credit for his contribution.
In a row, it goes to show the greatest team of all. It's Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic